Hey everybody, it's Comics G man. Gonna go right back to Larken Rose here. So, here are some more excerpts that I highlighted. A lot of stuff here, so hang tight, relax, and have a good time. Page 119, paragraph 3 and 4. This is not how people behave in their day-to-day lives. The average person does not go around initiating violence against everyone he meets because he is not sure that everyone he meets will otherwise behave properly and make the right decisions. But that is precisely what most statists do via government. They advocate the widespread, forcible control of millions of human beings simply because they are not entirely sure that people, if left in freedom, would spend their money the way they should, treat others the way they should, find peaceful, effective solutions to problems, etc. By way of the superstition of authority, statists can comfortably advocate the violent subjugation of their neighbors simply because they are not quite sure how their neighbors would otherwise behave. And those who crave power exploit that fact to their advantage. All the politicians need to do, in order to get support for an authoritarian power grab, is to tell the public that things might not work very well if he left people in freedom. He does not even need to wait until someone actually does something dishonest or malicious or otherwise destructive. All he has to do is suggest the possibility that if people are left in freedom, bad things might happen. Because advocates of government violence do not recognize law as violence, the threshold at which they will support an authoritarian, coerced solution is very low. Those who crave power can simply suggest that some plan might help someone somewhere, and many people will condone legal violence based upon that premise alone. So we go to page 120, paragraphs 1 to 3. As another example of advocating government violence by default, consider the practice of forcibly preventing foreigners from setting foot anywhere in an entire country without the written permission of the ruling class of that country. Such immigration laws create something akin to the war mentality, where an entire demographic category of people are criminalized and demonized, subjected to acts of aggression based upon concerns about what some of those people might do. People opine that many illegals are criminals or come into the country just to receive benefits. Regardless of how often such allegations are accurate, the results are that all illegals, anyone who is in the country without the permission of the politicians, are forcibly controlled. This is the result of pack mentality guilt by association. It should go without saying that using violence against one person because he is of the same race or from the same country, or in some other way similar to someone else who has actually caused harm, is utterly unjustified. Of note, the attempts by government to quell illegal immigration also result in aggression being perpetrated against many legal residents, as well as illegals at border patrol checkpoints, many of which are not even at the borders, to stop and question everyone driving down a road because someone may be there illegally, is precisely the kind of unjustified aggression commonly committed by government agents and rarely committed by anyone else. This violence by default can also be seen in the intrusive searches and interrogations of anyone who attempts to fly on a plane in the land of the free. For the owner of a plane to put conditions on anyone who wants to ride in his plane, and this would also apply to a train, car, anything, is very different from a third party forcibly preventing anyone from riding on any plane anywhere in an entire country, unless the would-be passengers first subject themselves to questioning, searches of their luggage, and even strip searches of themselves by the agents of the third party. People would never tolerate any private individual behaving this way, with the attitude of, I'd better force my will on everyone else, just in case. But for agents of authority, The tactic is commonplace, and people imagine it to be legitimate. In fact, they often demand that authority do such things. In their day-to-day lives, nonviolence is the default type of behavior for most people. While there are occasional physical conflicts, most people go to great lengths to avoid them, not only by trying not to start a fight, but also by trying to diffuse tense situations. Even when a fight does occur, both sides usually end up walking away. Each day, billions of people find ways to peacefully coexist, even when they have significantly different viewpoints, beliefs, and attitudes. But that is in their personal lives. When it comes to politics, violence is the default. Every voter, to one extent or another, seeks to have his own views and ideas forcibly inflicted upon everyone else through the mechanism of government. The default is not to let others do their own thing, or to try to get along peacefully. The default is to advocate aggression against absolutely everyone by way of the authoritarian coercion called law. There is a mind-bogglingly huge disconnect between what the average person views as civilized behavior on an individual basis, and what he views as legitimate and civilized when it comes to the actions of authority. It is difficult to imagine anyone behaving in his personal life the way voters behave when it comes to politics. Such a person would constantly be robbing others, friends and strangers alike, of huge sums of money to fund things he deems important, as well as using threats, physical force, and even kidnapping to coerce others into making whatever decisions he thinks would be best for his victims or for society in general. In short, anyone who acted in his private life the way all statists act in the political arena would be immediately recognized as a thug, a thief, and a lunatic. But doing exactly the same things through the government, advocating mass extortion, thuggery, is accepted by most as something that normal, civilized people should do. In fact, they sometimes refer to voting as a duty, as if it is actually immoral to not advocate the coercive controlling of one's neighbors. Amazingly and ironically, the only people who do not advocate constant widespread violence and coercion via government, known as voluntarists or anarchists, are usually viewed by the majority as being weird, uncivilized, and dangerous. Also, to go a little more off of the illegal immigrant thing, look, I was someone who at one time believed in the illegal immigrant being a threat. But as I got older, I realized that they're just being used by politicians just like us. And even in some cases, most cases, the illegal immigrants are getting it worse than us, because think about it. They're being sold this American dream like we are, except they're getting it worse. So they're going to get paid less, they get less rights than we do, right? So they are really, like, not only are they mentally enslaved like we are, but they are even more physically enslaved. So, and the Republicans talk like they're against illegal immigration all of a sudden, but as I was growing up, I recall, I always used to say, you know, it seems to me the Republicans are totally fine with illegal immigrations as long as they have them doing their lawn, their landscape, or all of these cheap jobs that they don't want to pay regular Americans, right? Supposedly. So the Republicans, they're not really against immigration. They're only against it now because it serves their purpose to win. It serves their purpose to do what they want at the moment. But years before that, the Republicans didn't give a shit about illegal immigration. You could go back to 2006. There was a Laura Ingraham book that I read a long time ago, and she said how George Bush was trying to give amnesty to millions of illegal immigrants all the way back in 2006. And that was a Republican. But it goes back to the point that we're all slaves. Some have it worse than others, of course. So let me go to page 124. This is a really good one. You guys are going to like this. He talks about liberals and conservatives, right? But first he covers liberals. He titles it Liberal Cowardice section, page 124. To be blunt, people want authority to exist because they themselves are immature cowards. They want an all-powerful entity to impose their will upon others. This takes different forms in different varieties of political advocacy, but the basic motivation is always the same. The liberal, for example, resents reality. He does not want a world in which suffering and injustice are possible. But instead of doing what he can as a human being, he wants a government to do it for him. He wants some magical entity to make sure that everyone, himself included, is fed, housed, and taken care of, no matter how lazy or irresponsible they are. Instead of trusting human beings to take care of each other, he wants a superhuman authority to guarantee housing, food, healthcare, and all sorts of other things for everyone. He wants it so badly that he refuses to accept the obvious truth that no such guarantee is ever possible, and that if mere mortals do not take care of themselves and each other, nothing else will take care of them. The liberal views the world as a continuation of the classroom, where there is always an authority in charge and in control who will make sure that the good kids are rewarded and protected from the bad kids. Each child is told what to do and taken care of, and all that is asked of him is that he does as he is told. He is expected to bear no responsibility at all for his own well-being, except through his obedience to the authority. He does not provide his own food, his own shelter, or his own protection, or anything else. He simply has faith that authorities, e.g., teachers and parents, will provide for him. He is raised in a setting which bears no resemblance to reality, and is taught to look to authority for all his needs. And the liberal continues to do exactly that long after he leaves school. He speaks of each person having a right to housing, food, healthcare, and other things, as if some giant tooth fairy is obliged to make such things magically appear for everyone. The nature of reality, though it stares him in the face every day, is too disturbing for him to acknowledge, because it is so different from the world he grew up in, where authority was responsible for everything. The government programs supported by liberals are a manifestation of their own delusional terror of reality and refusal to see the world as it is. They fear uncertainty so much that they try to hallucinate into existence a superhuman entity, government, that can somehow overcome all the uncertainties of reality and create an always safe, always predictable world. And when the mythological savior not only fails to fix the world, but makes everything far worse, as happened with the collectivist regimes of the Soviet Union, Cuba, China, and many others, the liberal still refuses to let go of his blind faith in the omniscient, omnipotent God called government. A simple analogy makes all liberal political theory collapse. If 100 people were shipwrecked on an island, what would it even mean to say that everyone there has a right to food, or that everyone has a right to health care, or the right to a job, or the right to a living wage? If, for example, someone has a right to housing, and housing comes only from the knowledge, skills, and efforts of other people, it means that one person has the right to force another person to build him a house. This is exactly what happens in larger context when liberals advocate that some people be forcibly robbed via taxation in order to provide benefits for others. The notion that people, by virtue of their mere existence, are entitled to all sorts of things which come into being only as the result of human knowledge and effort, is delusional. The logical result of this supposedly loving and compassionate viewpoint is violence and slavery. Because if one's needs entitles him to something, that means that it must be forcibly taken from anyone else who has it or can produce it if he will not supply it willingly. The fact that such a short-sighted, animalistic attitude, collectivism, is portrayed as a progressive, compassionate philosophy does not change the fact that it is, in reality, indistinguishable from the philosophy of rats and cockroaches. Regardless of who produced something, if someone else wants it or claims to need it, he should forcibly take it. The Communist Manifesto expresses this as from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Of course, there is a fundamental difference between suggesting that people who have wealth to spare ought to voluntarily help the less fortunate and advocating that violence should be used to make things fair. Government programs are never about asking people to help each other. They are always about using threats and aggression to force people to do certain things and behave in certain ways. But the myth of authority allows liberals to advocate widespread, constant violence and intimidation, while still imagining themselves to be caring and compassionate. In essence, what political leftists want is an all-knowing, all-powerful mommy to force people to share and play nice, and they ignore the fact that there is no such thing, that imagining such a thing only adds to violence, suffering, and misery to society. Next subsection. Conservative cowardice. As much as political liberals want a giant mommy state to protect and take care of everyone, political conservatives want a giant daddy state doing the same thing. The results are slightly different, but the underlying delusion is the same. The desire for an all-powerful authority to protect humanity from reality. The right-wing delusion focuses less on motherly pampering and hand-holding and focuses more on fatherly protection and discipline. Conservatives want authority to be used to create a big, powerful protection machine and to firmly impose morality upon the population, which they imagine to be necessary for the survival of mankind. Their denial of reality is just as strong as that of the leftist. Again, the island analogy demonstrates the point well. If 100 people were shipwrecked on an island, who would imagine that forcing most of them to serve and obey a protector would be necessary or useful? And who would imagine that letting one or two of them forcibly impose their morals on the rest would make such a group more virtuous? A conservative daddy form of government is the equivalent of a disciplinarian father who acts as protector of the family from outside forces, the equivalent to the government military, and protector of each member of the family from others in the family, the equivalent of domestic law enforcement, and the one who keeps undesirables away from the family, the equivalent of immigration laws, as well as the enforcer of morality, who punishes family members who disobey the rules. This last item equates to laws against pornography, prostitution, gambling, drug use, and other habits and behaviors which, although they do not constitute force or fraud against anyone, are thought by many to be destructive, physically, morally, or spiritually to those who engage in them. But trying to forcibly impose morality is more damaging than the behaviors themselves. Aside from the fact that no one has the right to forcibly control the non-violent choices of another, it is also horribly dangerous to set the precedent that it is okay to use violence to stamp out unseemly or distasteful behavior. Once such a premise is accepted in principle, human society will be at constant war with everyone and against everyone. There will never be a time when everyone shares the same values and viewpoints. Peace and freedom cannot exist if every difference of opinion and every difference in lifestyles or behaviors leads to violent conflict through the government coercion. Civilization, a state of peaceful coexistence, is not the result of everyone believing the same thing, but of people agreeing to refrain from initiating violence, even against people who do not believe the same things. Conservative statism, just as much as the liberal version, guarantees perpetual strife and conflict because it seeks to override free will and individual judgment with the so-called morality of a ruling class, whose first principle is forced conformity and sameness. So, of course, violence cannot create virtue, even if it sometimes creates obedience. So all attempts by authority to coerce people into being moral and virtuous are doomed to fail, and ultimately to do nothing but increase the levels of violence and conflict in society. Page 129. I'll read the whole page of 129, checking the microphone. The Constitution of the Soviet Union, for example, described an authority which was to treat everyone equally, regardless of race or religion, occupation or sex, and to preserve the individual rights of all citizens in their economic, political, and social lives. The rights enumerated in the Soviet Constitution included freedom of speech and freedom of religion, the right to work, the right to rest and leisure, the right to housing, the right to education, health care, the right to citizens to be cared for in their old age, among other things. The real-world result of that noble-sounding experiment, however, was constant violent repression, harassment, intimidation, economic enslavement, forced suppression of thoughts and opinions, widespread poverty, and the murder of tens of millions of human beings, many via intentionally orchestrated starvation. The Constitution of the People's Republic of China is very similar to that of the Soviet Union, and the results were similar as well: widespread violent repression, tyranny, as well as mass murder. The attempt by Chinese authorities to use the violence of the state to reduce population growth has had particularly horrendous and deplorable results. And also, to go off of that, that is also backfiring on them. When they were trying to control the population of their people, when they were killing their daughters, they wanted to have sons, all the horrible things that they did to their own people. Well, the results don't look good, because the Chinese people, even with the amount of people that they have in China, they too are also facing the problem of a population decline. So all of that government intervention didn't do anybody any good. And if you think that the answer to getting more babies and having a more high population is going to be government intervention, like I heard Trump wanted to give a stimulus check of $5,000 for people to have babies, that's not going to solve anything. It's going to come down to the individuals at the end of the day. And we're going to have to shake ourselves from government. And otherwise, it's not going to get better. And Larken Rose will prove this further in his book, and I'll tell you more about it. To continue, tyrants have always professed to have the noblest intentions for what they do, but even good intentions, when added to the belief in authority, always result in immoral violence. When added to sometimes to an almost incomprehensible degree. Even without all of the historical examples, it should be obvious that trying to achieve compassion and fairness, love and virtue, cooperation and brotherhood by way of authoritarian aggression and violence is insane. And that government, by its very nature, as a tool of forcible control, can never and will never lead to justice, peace, and harmony. And that, if you guys ever watch Jim Breuer, I know some people don't like him, but I like Jim Breuer, the comedian. He always brings up Bob Marley. He always says what Bob Marley says. Bob Marley says, all government is illegal, man. Right, exactly. Bob knew what he was saying. It is also worth noting that the political left and right are both enamored with the concept of equality, with the political right pushing for equality under the law, and the left pushing for equality of outcomes. But neither actually wants true equality, because they both exempt the ruling class from such equality. True equality rules out all government, because a ruler and a subject obviously can never be equals. What statists actually want is equality among the slaves, but enormous inequality between the slaves and the masters. This again shows that they view government as being superhuman, because it never occurs to them as they push equality for all, that the equality should also include the politicians and the police. To go off of that, now, whatever your opinions are about the Jeffrey Epstein Island stuff that's been going on, this is an example, right? Whether, and I hear people that think that it's just a psychological operation and it's just not even real. Other people who are saying it's a leftist hoax. I just want to use it as an example of what Larken was just saying. Now, before Trump was accused of being at Epstein's Island, and if you looked at the list, I saw his name on the list a long time ago, and plenty of other people who were on the list who happened to be on the right. But before that, the people on the right were talking about putting the pedophiles in jail, putting people in jail for being at Epstein Island or associating with Epstein Island. But the moment that the people that they put in power are most likely involved in something like that, all of a sudden the people on the right, they're not advocating for it for them, right? But if it was regular people who were involved in an island like that with children or teenagers, whatever the case, that would not happen. That silence would not occur. That they would make sure that they would go to jail. But when it comes to the ruling class that they put in power, all of a sudden everybody's going out of their way to either be quiet about it or to either cover up for the person that they want in power to stay in power. There is no equal justice in that term. So yes, Larken Rose is correct. Whatever you think of that situation. Paragraph 2, page 130. The subsection is big or small, left or right. It's still evil. In statist mythology, the political left wing and the political right wing are opposites. In reality, they are two sides of the same coin. The difference lies only in what the different voters hope those in power will do with that power. But in practice, left and right politicians all engage in wealth redistribution, warmongering, centralized control of commerce, and numerous coercive restrictions upon the behavior of their subjects. As right-wing and left-wing states approach complete power, they become utterly indistinguishable from one another. Hitler's supposedly far-right regime and Stalin's supposedly far-left regime were virtually identical. Whatever the original stated purpose of either, the end result was complete power and control for the politicians, and complete helplessness and enslavement of everyone else. Being allowed to choose between the political left and the political right provides the people with exactly as much power and freedom as allowing them to choose between death by hanging and death by firing squad. And adding an independent third party only adds the option of death by electrocution. As long as the people bicker only about which gang should enslave everyone, also known as democracy, the people will remain enslaved. And it's like what I was talking about in that video I made about Dark Knight Rises, where Scarecrow was saying, death or exile, or basically death or death by exile. Like, what would no difference in the choice? You're gonna die either way, but do you choose a quick death or death by walking on a frozen river under the bridge and falling and dying of hypothermia? You know, so that's pretty much what he's saying about the left-right paradigm, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. He explains it brilliantly. Page 131, paragraphs 2 to 3. Likewise, conservative pundits on talk radio and elsewhere sanctimoniously chastise liberals for advocating the forced redistribution of wealth, while the pundits do exactly the same thing for the slightly different purposes. To criticize welfare while supporting corporate subsidies, or to criticize attempts to legislate fairness while supporting the war on drugs, or to criticize liberal plans to nationalize industry while supporting a giant forcibly funded government military, which amounts to nationalizing the protection industry, shows a complete absence of philosophical principles, while at the same time it is equally hypocritical for liberals to righteously condemn right-wing warmongering while supporting a giant, intrusive, vicious extortion racket, taxation, or to complain about the intolerance of the right while advocating all manner of authoritarian behavioral controls. In truth, there is no real difference between the philosophical principles of one statist and another, because they both accept the premise that a ruling class, with the right to control and rob the population, is necessary and legitimate. The only argument after that is not one of principle, but simply a debate over how the loot should be distributed and what choices should be forced upon the peasants. There is no such thing as a tolerant liberal or a tolerant conservative, because not one of them tolerates people spending their own money and controlling their own lives. 131, paragraph 3. It is true that the degree of evil and the types of immoral aggression advocated vary based upon the different styles of statism. Constitutionalists, for example, advocate relatively low levels of robbery and extortion, taxation, and advocate that only certain limited activities and behaviors should be controlled via threats and coercion, regulation. But every power which any constitution pretends to grant to any legislature is a power not possessed by mere mortal individuals. Who would bother writing into a constitution a line pretending to delegate to certain people a right already possessed by everyone else? All such grants of power, and any document purporting to create a government or empower any legislature to do anything, are attempts to issue a license to commit evil. However, as should be patently self-evident, no person or group of people, regardless of what documents they create or rituals they perform, can grant to someone else moral permission to commit evil. And putting supposed limits on such permissions does not make it any more sane or legitimate. In short, to advocate government is always to advocate evil. Page 133, paragraph 1 to the end. The belief in authority negates and overrides nearly all of the positive effects of religious and moral beliefs. What most people call their religion is empty window dressing, and what most people tout as their moral virtue is irrelevant, as long as they believe in the myth of authority. Christians, for example, are taught things such as, if someone strikes you, turn the other cheek, love your neighbor, and even love your enemy, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Oh my God, I am immortal, I just burped. Yet, every so-called Christian who believes in government constantly forsakes these principles, advocating constant aggression against everyone, friend, enemy, neighbor, stranger, through the cult of government, to put on a show of being pious, religious, compassionate, loving, and virtuous, while voting for a gang that promises to use violence to control the actions of everyone you know, is the height of hypocrisy. To refrain from personally robbing one's neighbor while pushing for someone else to do it is both cowardly and hypocritical. Yet, almost every Christian and every member of every other religion does such things on a regular basis by way of political advocacy. As mentioned before, faith in government is purely religious belief. As such, the vast majority of those who wear the label atheist are not actually atheists because they believe in the God called government. They do not recognize it as a religious belief, of course, but their belief in that ethereal, superhuman savior of mankind, authority, is as deep and faith-based as any other religious belief. Ironically, atheists are often quick to point out the destruction that has been committed throughout history in the name of religion, but they fail to notice the gruesome results of the God that they bow to, government. The atheists are absolutely right to point out that when churches were the accepted authority, the organizations thought to have the right to forcibly control others. Many of them committed large-scale, heinous acts of terrorism, torture, and murder. But what most modern atheists fail to realize, despite the clear evidence staring them in the face, is that they are the members of the most destructive church in history, the Church of Government, which has managed to wreak havoc, death, destruction, on a level far beyond what even the most vicious churches of the past did. For example, over the span of 200 years, around 1 or 2 million people were killed in the religious wars known as the Crusades. In comparison, in half that amount of time in the 20th century, over 100 times as many people were killed by the progressive policies of collectivist governments. Advances in technology no doubt played a large role in the increase in deaths, but the point remains, whether the mask of authority is worn by a church or a state, the superstition is horribly dangerous, and the results horribly destructive. The fact that so many atheists eagerly condemn one form of superstition while vehemently advocating it in another shows an amazing degree of selective blindness. Often those most critical of oppression via religion are some of the most devout true believers in the God called government. To continue, subsection, no objective standard. Again, in the eyes of those who believe in government, there is a world of difference between acceptable individual behavior and acceptable government behavior. When an individual steals $100, it is seen as an immoral crime. When those in government steal trillions of dollars every year, it is seen as acceptable. If the average individual prints his own $100 bill and goes out to spend, that is seen as fraud and counterfeiting, an immoral act akin to theft. When government gives legal permission for the Federal Reserve to do the same thing, but with trillions of fiat out of thin air dollars, that is seen as acceptable, even useful and necessary, while various governments have declared that the average man is not allowed to possess firearms. The mercenaries of government are allowed to have guns, bombs, fighter jets, tanks, missiles, even nuclear warheads. Ironically, think about it, right? You hear our government, they're always talking about against the Second Amendment, they're worried about shootings and all these things. But think about the atrocities that the government has committed on people, not only here, but throughout the world. And they have the gall to worry about us. No, all they're worried about is us eventually having the ability to defend ourselves from them. That's all it's about. There's no morality in it. It's just all control. Ironically, such weapons, with the exception of nuclear weapons, are routinely put into the hands of the very same people who, before they became mercenaries for the state, were prohibited from possessing firearms. In other words, when those individuals use their own judgment, some politicians declare them to be too untrustworthy and too much of a danger to society to be trusted with a 5-shot revolver. But when those same people are blindly following orders, obeying the chain of command, those same politicians declare that they can be trusted to have assault rifles, sniper rifles, grenades, mounted machine guns, tanks, fighter jets, bombers, heavy artillery, and countless other tools of large-scale destruction. But God forbid you have an AR-15, or a rifle, or a pistol, or any other means to defend yourself. How dare you, you plebe? In addition to the huge chasm between what the masses perceive to be acceptable individual behavior and acceptable government behavior, the public sense of when government has gone too far seems almost random. The standards by which average individuals are judged are simple and constant. If they steal, defraud, assault, or murder, that is bad. But the measure of right and wrong for government seems largely arbitrary. For example, it is now widely accepted that outlawing alcohol would be unjustified, but outlawing marijuana and using widespread constant violence to enforce that prohibition is legitimate. As an even more bizarre contradiction, most people would be rightfully offended if government attempted to coerce everyone into picking up litter in his own neighborhood, but most accept it as legitimate when government, through the military draft, coerces people into going to another country to either kill people or die. Bizarrely, this most heinous example of forced labor, forcing people to go to halfway around the world to murder complete strangers, was even committed by a government whose own rules, through the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, directly prohibits involuntary servitude. And just to add on that, on my thought, I remember reading about that And I saw that in the 13th Amendment about involuntary servitude. And I'm like, holy hell, it's in the Constitution. And they were having drafts, and they got all these other ways of forcing people to do things. But that's why Larken Rose is correct. Not even the Constitution can protect you from government. It doesn't protect you. So you'll find out what Larken's solution is to pretty much rid government. And it's not what you think. It's not a revolution like I thought. I thought it would be a revolution and an uprising, but it's not. It's something actually more individual, more, I think more realistic actually. And I think it's more possible. I could envision this. It is clear that the limits of what government is allowed to do, as far as the general public is concerned, are not based on any principle whatsoever. One reason people throughout the world and throughout history have been so slow to resist tyranny is that as long as the growth of tyranny is slow and steady, the tyrants are never seen as having crossed the line. This is because without any underlying principles by which to gauge right and wrong, there can be no line to cross. The belief in authority is completely incompatible with any moral principles, precisely because the essence of the belief is the idea that those in authority are not bound by the same rules of conduct as their subjects. Logically, how could the subjects ever be justified in dictating standards of behavior to their masters? If taxation, forced confiscation of wealth, increases from 62 to 63%, how could any statist on principle declare that any line had been crossed, or that government had overstepped its bounds? There can be no principled objection to robbery unless it is an objection against any level of robbery, even if legal. If 1% forced confiscation of wealth by government is legitimate in principle, then so is 99%. Either the rulers own the people and have the right to take as much as they please, or the people own themselves and the rulers have no right to forcibly take anything from them. There can be no principle anywhere in between. How could there be? What possible rational basis could there be for holding the belief that, well, 46% slavery good, but that 47% slavery is bad? How could there be any principled line anywhere in between 0 and 100%? When the violence of government becomes too widespread, too arbitrary, and too vicious, even devout statists very slowly begin to question it. But there are no real principles guiding how they judge the righteousness of the actions of the ruling class. Once it is accepted that one group of people has the inherent right to commit acts of aggression against others, there is no objective standard for limiting such right. If government can require people to have a license to drive to the corner store, why can it not require people to have a license to walk down the street? If it is legitimate for lawmakers to demand that private firearms be registered and regulated, why is it not also legitimate for them to demand that all forms of speech and expression be registered and regulated? If it is okay for politicians to create an enforced government monopoly on delivering letters, as the U.S. Postal Service has, why is it not okay for them to create an enforced government monopoly on telephone services? Well, I believe they already do that. This is me, Gio, here. I believe they already do that through social media, Facebook, Twitter, your cell phones. Now, they're private companies, but I think the government is really deeply inside them. So even though on the surface it looks like the phones you buy and the services you use are privately made, I think they're already controlled by the government because they're collecting all that data and they're willingly selling it to the CIA, NSA. So it's not really private either. So they're already at that point. And it's only going to get worse because the way they're going to limit your speech, it's not going to be with tyrants and their guns. It's going to be with these laws, and it's going to be with these policies. And they're going to make it where people don't meet and speak with each other. And the only form of talking to one another is going to be through like what I'm doing right now. But then YouTube is going to have these little things that you can't say. I'm going to say them anyway. I don't give a shit. Whatever I could eventually monetize, I monetize, right? But if I can't monetize something, but it's a message I really believe, I don't care. I'm going to say what I believe. I'm not going to edit it around your bullshit policies. Like, for example, that video I made on the fake Christian thing, I was trying to promote it because I really felt like I really believed in the video that I made, and I wanted to push it out there a little bit, you know? And it didn't work. It didn't let me do it. It said because something with the election advertising. I made no mention about elections. I was criticizing the fake Christians on the right from MAGA people. I was calling out how it's going to be the Christians now who are going to be pushing the anti-free speech. And they're also going to, believe me, the Christians who talk about revelations and the Christians who talk about the beast system, guys, these are going to be the people who are going to push those on us. You watch. So anyway, so just with some baloney policy of YouTube, you don't allow me to promote my own material that I believe in. So I'm just going to leave it the way it is, and hopefully my channel, when it grows more audience, people eventually look at that video on their own. Otherwise, you could also look it up on Rumble, and Rumble's okay. It's doing okay, actually. It's doing better organically compared to YouTube. I'll say that about Rumble. Alright, so back to this. The reason government is always a slippery slope, constantly pushing away from freedom and toward totalitarianism, is that once someone accepts the premise of a ruling class, there is no objective basis whatsoever for applying any limits to the powers of that ruling class. Exactly. There can be no rational moral standard for saying that a certain person has the right to commit acts of aggression, theft, intimidation, assault, and coercion, but that he may commit such acts only to a certain degree, or only if necessary. It's ridiculous. It actually is very ridiculous the more you think about it. For slaves to concede that they are the rightful property of someone else, only to then claim that there are limits on what their owners may do to them, is a logical contradiction. Likewise, for a subject to accept any master, including one called government, and to then imagine that he, the subject, will decide the extent of the master's powers, defies logic and reality, yet that is what all believers in representative government seek to do. In short, those who believe in authority have accepted on the most fundamental level that they are owned by someone else, the people claiming to have authority. Having accepted that idea, they then proceed to beg their masters for favors. In doing so, however, the people are continually reinforcing the idea that ultimately it is up to the masters what will be done with the subjects. The one constant message that echoes throughout the entire political process is this: here are the things that we, the people, ask you, the rulers, to allow us to do. The implicit message underlying all political action is that the only power the people have is the power to whine and beg, and that ultimately it is always up to the masters what will happen. To push for any change in the law is to accept that the law is legitimate. In contrast, if an armed driver was accosted by a carjacker with a knife, the driver would feel no need to lobby the aggressor, to beg him to give his permission for the driver to keep his own car. If the driver had the means to forcibly repel the attacker, he would have every right to do so. To ask for something is to accept that the decision is the other person's to make. To ask those in government for a bit more freedom is to admit that it is up to them whether the people may be free or not. In other words, to ask for freedom is to not be free, but to accept one's subjugation to someone else. Consider what an oxymoron it is for a person to claim to have an unalienable right to do something, yet then to ask the politicians for their legislative permission to do that thing. The belief in authority ultimately leads even those who imagine themselves to be ardent pro-freedom advocates to condone their own subjugation, no matter how loudly they demand that the politicians change some law. Those who claim to love freedom while still suffering from the authority superstition merely reinforce the legitimacy of the ruling class's control over them by implicitly agreeing that the people need a ruling class's legislative permission in order to have the right to do anything. Alright, guys, here's a biggie. Here's a biggie. This is an important one here. This is a long one. But this is the most important section of Larken Rose's book because it's called The Effect on Freedom Advocates. And this is very important to know because I fell into these traps as well, believing in the ideas of like libertarianism, constitutionalism, because all of those also go back to the answer that, well, we don't want big government, we want limited, smaller government. But that doesn't work either because you still have government. And even with these illusions of limited government or small government, who actually checks if it's limited or small? It doesn't actually work the way it sounds. But Larken goes over this beautifully, so let's go over the effect on freedom advocates. Government itself does no harm because it is a fictional entity, but the belief in government, the notion that some people actually have the moral right to rule over others, have caused immeasurable pain and suffering, injustice and oppression, enslavement and death. The fundamental problem does not reside in any set of buildings or any group of politicians or any gang of soldiers or enforcers. The fundamental problem is not an organization that can be voted out, overthrown, or reformed. And look, Geo again, I even fell for that. I even thought that as well. And I think Larken here is onto something. I think he's absolutely right here. Listen. The fundamental problem is the belief itself. The delusion, superstition, and myth of authority, which resides in the minds of several billion human beings, including those who have suffered the most because of that belief. Ironically, the belief in authority dramatically affects the perception and actions even of those who are actively fighting against a particular regime. The superstition drastically alters and limits the ways in which dissenters fight oppression, and renders nearly all of their efforts impotent. Furthermore, on the rare occasion that a particular tyrant is toppled, one form of oppression is almost always replaced by another, often one that is even worse than the prior one. Absolutely. And you know what? You guys are going to laugh at me. Going back to my comic roots here, I remember reading a Transformers novel from 2010, and it was talking about like the origins of the fall of Cybertron. And Megatron, he said the same thing to Optimus Prime. And Megatron, in the book, he was like this gladiator that was fighting against the high classes of the Transformers. I forgot what it was called exactly, and it told you why they became Decepticons and why they became Autobots. Really cool shit. To my comic fans, if you happen to be listening to this as well, you either know what I'm talking about and appreciate Transformers, and if you like it, Transformers, but you never read that novel, I highly recommend you look it up. It's from 2010. You could probably find it real easy. I forgot what it was called. But Megatron, when he finally shows Optimus that he wasn't really about freeing the people, he's saying once there's a vacuum of power, there will be something else to take its place. And Megatron wanted to take over that power. Sorry to geek out on you guys here, but I can't help it a little bit. I am a comic book channel with my politics mixed in a little bit. Alright, so back to this. Instead of fighting against the non-existent beast, what freedom fighters need to do is to recognize that it is not real, that it does not exist, that it cannot exist, and then act accordingly. Like, dude, Larken Rose, man, you know what he reminds me of? He's like that kid in the Matrix that had the spoon. This is not a spoon, and the spoon was like bending. Like, Larken, this is some of the best stuff I've heard. Like, you hear these people say, oh, we live in the Matrix, we live in a simulation. I don't believe that either. I think a lot of that is nonsense. There's some truth to it in terms of like, we see some crazy things, I guess. I never seen the glitches in the Matrix, but Larken, I think, is really like Morpheus here. He's really like showing you it's all in here, man. Everything is all in our mind. It really is. It really is. And it's like that one saying, we create the hell. Anyway, of course, if only a few people overcome the superstition, they will likely be ridiculed, condemned, attacked, imprisoned, murdered by those who are still firm believers in the myth. But when even a significant minority of people outgrow this superstition and change their behavior accordingly, the world will drastically change. When the people actually want true freedom, they will achieve it without the need for any election or revolution. And you know what? I'm actually really relieved to hear that, because I'm telling you, I was one of those people, and then not a long ago, like pretty recently, that believed the only way out is revolution. The only way out is like a revolution, like Dark Knight Rises stuff, except, you know, you actually try to get what you want. But it's not, man. It just leads to another worse form of tyranny. And I think Larken Rose is hitting the nail, and Larken kind of snapped me out of that a little bit. He kind of snapped me out of that idea. And it's true, because you think of all these other people who have had revolutions over the past 100 or so years. It hasn't really changed anything, and we still live under the oppression of government and taxation. So yeah, absolutely, and especially in our times right now, I think revolution isn't going to work at all. I think what he's saying here of the mind is our best shot. As wild, as out of this world it sounds, it is our last best shot. I really believe that now. The trouble is, almost no one actually wants humanity to be free, and almost no one opposes oppression in principle. The effects of the myth of authority remain intact even in the minds of most people who consider themselves to be rebels, nonconformists, and free thinkers. During their teenage years, many people go through a period of apparent rebelliousness, which consists mostly of doing whatever those in authority tell them not to, engaging in smoking, sexual promiscuity, drug use, wearing different clothes or hairstyles, getting tattoos, body piercings, and so on. As such, their actions are still controlled, albeit in a backward way, by the myth of authority. And he's kind of right? Like, so you're actually giving credence to authority by going out of your way and giving all this power to authority to be the opposite of what the authority is. So you're actually empowering it more in a way. When you're getting all those tattoos and you're making yourself with the piercings and you think you're being a rebel, you're actually only legitimizing authority in a way, because you're making its effect on you have an effect on you. Instead of obeying for the sake of obeying, they disobey for the sake of disobeying, but still show no signs of being able to think for themselves. They behave like angry children instead of complacent children, but still do not behave like adults. And in most cases, their natural desire to break the chains of authority does not last long. They outgrow their anti-authoritarian tendencies and gradually transform back into model citizens, or i.e. obedient subjects. And absolutely, man, the TV shows show this. They kind of condition people to be this way. You know, go through your rebellious years, and then you'll have, or that other saying that reminds me of, oh, well, when you're young and you're dumb, you're a leftist, and you have a heart. But when you're old and you still are a leftist, you don't have a brain, or you're a conservative. So, I mean, I'm not saying that part's great. I'm saying that it's true. That I've known people in college too that they were all about this rebellion, and they did all these things, whether it was they wanted to be a lesbian, or they wanted to be gay, just not because they actually were, but because that was what everyone else was doing, and they wanted to rebel against the whatever authority it was at the time that they were identifying, whether it was the patriarchy or whatever shit they come up with, you know. But in a way, I would even argue and solidify what Larken is saying, that complete contradiction, that disobeying of authority is by design, and it's also a way to enforce and break other people down, people who have those tendencies to want to not be under authority. You allow them to express themselves in these almost insane, inhuman, wild ways that are really they're actually all acceptable in some terms because it still allows the machine to run, correct? These people that express themselves in these ways, they're still going to go to work, they go to school, they're still operating in the system in some way. So that rebellion is it's kind of a false rebellion in a way. For example, the supposedly radical anti-authoritarian hippies of the 1960s, more or less, became the new government of the United States with the presidency of Bill Clinton. Even the peaceniks, whose mantra was live and let live, when given the opportunity to become the new authority, chose to forcibly meddle with the lives of others as much as or more than their predecessors did, including via military conquest. Likewise, those in Generation X, the MTV crowd, and so on, have always focused their efforts on putting people who agree with them into power, instead of working to actually achieve freedom. There is a fundamental difference between having complaints about a particular ruling class and recognizing and opposing the insanity of authority in principle. In short, in all the various societal manifestations of so-called rebelliousness, nonconformity, almost none actually escape the myth of authority. Instead, they have merely attempted to make a new authority, a new ruling class, a new government, a new centralized machine of coercion through which they could forcibly subjugate and control their neighbors. In short, nearly all so-called rebels are phonies who pretend to be resisting the man, but who really just want to be the man. And you know who else talked about this? George Carlin. Remember, if you guys have watched George Carlin, you remember he used to say, man, the hippies, man, they're all about free love and all this, but now they're become about no pain, no gain, more Rogaine, more coke, like they became super control freaks, they became super capitalist, whatever. George Carlin was way ahead of his time. Way ahead of his time. Unbelievable. I wish he was still alive, although maybe it's merciful. Maybe he's in peace right now and he's enjoying his life. But hell, I would love to see him and a guy like Larken Rose have a conversation. I bet these guys could have a great conversation about this. And this should be expected. If one starts with the assumption that there should and must be an authority, and that a government exerting control over population is a legitimate situation, why would anyone not want to be the one in charge? Each person, by definition, wants the world to be the way he thinks it should be. And what better way could any person accomplish that than by becoming king? If someone accepts the notion that authoritarian power is valid, why would he not want it to be used to try to create the world that he wants it to be? This is why the only people who truly advocate freedom in principle are anarchists and voluntarists. People who understand that forcibly dominating others is not legitimate, even when it is called law, and even when it is done in the name of the people or the common good. There is a big difference between striving for a new, wiser, nobler master and striving for a world of equals where there are no masters and no slaves. Likewise, there is a big difference between a slave who believes in the principle of freedom and a slave whose ultimate goal is to become the new master. And this is true even if that slave truly intends to be a kind and generous master. Even those who advocate a relatively limited, benign type of government are advocating against freedom. As long as the people believe in the myth of authority, every downfall of one tyrant will be followed by the creation and growth of a new tyrant. History is replete with examples, such as Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who portrayed themselves as freedom fighters just long enough to become the new oppressors. They were no doubt quite genuine in their vehement opposition to the oppressions which they and their friends suffered from. But they were not opposed to authoritarian oppression in principle, as clearly demonstrated by their behavior once they obtained power themselves. This pattern has been repeated over and over again throughout history, with the resentment of one tyrannical regime becoming the seed of the next tyrannical regime. Even Hitler's rise to power was due in large part to anger at the perceived injustices and oppressions inflicted upon Germany through the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, as long as the rebels suffer from the superstition of authority, their first priority, once they have overthrown one government, will be to set up a new one. So even acts of bravery and heroism among those who still believe in government have accomplished little more than replacing one tyrant with another. Many have been able to recognize and oppose specific acts of tyranny by specific regimes, but very few have recognized that the underlying problem is not who sits on the throne. The problem is that there is a throne to sit on. The same failure to recognize the real problem occurs in more mundane, relatively peaceful reform as well. In the US, for example, a large portion of the population is perfectly able to see the injustices resulting from the war on drugs, global warmongering, and other violations of civil rights committed by Republican tyrants. However, not recognizing the belief in authority as the real problem, the solution proposed by those who recognize such injustice is to give the reins of government to Democrat tyrants instead. Meanwhile, another large portion of the population is perfectly able to see the injustices resulting from heavy taxation, government micromanaging of industry, wealth redistribution schemes, citizen disarmament, gun control, etc. But not recognizing the belief in authority as the real problem, the solution proposed by those who recognize such injustices is to give the reins of government back to Republican tyrants. And so, decade after decade, the machine of oppression changes hands, while individual freedom in all aspects of life continues to dwindle. And still, all that most Americans can even contemplate as a solution is yet another election, another political party, or another lobbying effort in the hope of begging the ruling class to be more wise and benevolent. Some people, seeing the disaster caused by the two-party system, blame extremism for the negative effects of government. They surmise that if people would only support a form of coercive control somewhere in between the far left and the far right, well, things would improve. Oh, give me a sec. Checking the mic. Such people claim to be independent, open-minded, and moderate, but in reality are merely general advocates of oppression instead of being advocates of a particular flavor of oppression. The left and right are merely two masks which the one ruling class wears, and making a new mask which is a compromise between the other two will have no effect whatsoever upon the nature of the beast or the destruction it causes. Taking a position halfway between left-wing tyranny and right-wing tyranny does not result in freedom. It results in bipartisan tyranny. Among those who vote Democrat or Republican or any other party, no one recognizes the underlying problem, and as a result, no one ever gets any closer to a solution. They remain slaves, because their thoughts and discussions are limited to the pointless question of who should be their master. They never consider, and dare not consider, the possibility that they should have no master at all. As a result, they focus entirely on political action of one kind or another, which is all founded on the belief in authority, which is the problem itself. So the efforts of statists are, and always will be, doomed to fail. This is even true of the less mainstream, supposedly more pro-freedom political movements, including constitutionalists, the libertarian parties, and others. As long as they think and act within the confines of government game, their efforts are not only completely incapable of solving the problem, but actually aggravate the problem by inadvertently legitimizing the system of domination and subjugation, which wears the label of government. Alright, and I'm going to go to page 142, and I'm going to read paragraphs 1 to 2. And also, he made a really good quote I wrote down here by Daniel Webster, of all people. I thought this was very cool that he put this in here. Daniel Webster's quote, "There are men in all ages who mean to govern well, but they mean to govern. They promise to be good masters, but they mean to be masters. So there's from the words of Daniel Webster. Brilliantly put. He took everything that Larken Rose said and he said it in just a sentence. Brilliant. Alright, so let me go on. While the intended message of dissenters may be that they disapprove of what the masters are doing, the actual message that all political action sends to those in power is, we wish you would change your commands, but we will continue to obey whether you do or not. The truth is, one who seeks to achieve freedom by petitioning those in power to give it to him has already failed, regardless of the response. To beg for the blessing of authority is to accept that the choice is the master's alone to make, which means that the person is already by definition a slave. One who begs for lower taxes, implicitly agreeing that it is up to the politicians how much a man may keep of what he has earned. One who begs the politicians not to disarm him via gun control is by doing so conceding that it is up to the master whether to let the man be armed or not. In fact, those who lobby for politicians to respect any of the people's unalienable rights do not believe in unalienable rights at all. Rights which require government approval are not unalienable, and are not even rights. That is privilege. Those are privileges, granted or withheld at the whim of the master. And those who hold positions of power know that they have nothing to fear from people who do nothing but pathetically beg for freedom and justice. However, loudly the dissenters talk about demanding their rights. The message they actually send is this: we agree, master, that it is up to you what we may and may not do. So yes, absolutely. So, as I'm of the belief, and of Larken is of the belief, we should not even be participating in these games. At all. At all. We should just be living our lives and ignoring them, frankly. And if we did it en masse, and you don't need everyone to do it, just a small minority, right? It'll fall apart real quick, believe me. Alright, number 146, paragraphs 1 to 4 to the end section. So, in short, if the goal is individual freedom, political action is not only worthless, it is hugely counterproductive because the main thing it accomplishes is to legitimize the ruling class's power. The only way to achieve freedom is to first achieve mental freedom by realizing that no one has any right to rule another, which means that government is never legitimate. It is never moral. It is never even real. Those who have not yet realized that and continue to try to petition the system to make them free are playing right into the hands of the tyrants. Even petitioning for lower levels of taxation or government spending, or asking for things to be legalized or deregulated, or begging for other reductions in government control over the people, still does nothing to address the real problem, and in fact adds to the real problem by unwittingly repeating and reinforcing the idea that if the people want freedom, they need to have freedom legalized. Political action by its very nature always empowers the ruling class and disempowers the people. If enough people recognize and let go of the authority myth, there is no need for any election, any political action, or any revolution. If the people did not imagine themselves to have an obligation to obey the politicians would literally be ignored into irrelevance. In fact, the belief in democracy dramatically reduces the ability of the people to resist tyranny by limiting the ways in which they resist it. For example, if 49% of the population wanted to lower levels of taxation but maintain their belief in authority, they could accomplish exactly nothing via democracy. On the other hand, if even 10% of the population wanted no taxation at all and had escaped the myth of authority, including the democratic kind, they could achieve their goal easily by simple non-compliance. Using the US as an example, if 20 million people less than 10% of American taxpayers, openly refused to cooperate with attempts by the IRS to extort them, the ruling class would be powerless to do anything about it, and the infamous Internal Revenue Service, along with the massive extortion racket it administers, would grind to a halt. It would be utterly impossible for 100,000 IRS employees to continually rob millions of Americans who felt no obligation to pay. In fact, it would be impossible for any agency to enforce any law which even a fraction of the public could disobey with no feeling of shame or guilt. Brute force alone could not achieve compliance. Any large population of people that did not perceive obedience in and of itself to be a virtue and felt no inherent duty to obey the commands of those claiming the right to rule would be utterly impossible to oppress. Wars occur because people feel obliged to go into battle when authority tells them to. As the saying goes, what if they had a war and nobody came? As long as the people can be duped into perpetually begging for freedom to be legalized, they will be easy to subjugate and control. As long as a person's perceived duty to obey authority outranks his own individual judgment, his beliefs and values are, practically speaking, irrelevant. Unless and until a freedom advocate is willing to disobey the master, to break the law, his supposed love of freedom is a lie and will accomplish nothing. Page 148. This section is called A Mix of Wisdom and Insanity, and I think this is very interesting to anybody who likes the Constitution like I did and do to an extent. And your founding fathers, we like talking about the founding fathers. Wait until you hear what Larken Rose thinks of this, and it's very fascinating. Listen. A mix of wisdom and insanity. In the late 18th century, something very unusual occurred. Something that seemed as if it might break the perpetual cycle of serial tyrants. That event was the signing of the Declaration of Independence. What made that event unusual was not that the people were rebelling against a tyrant, which had happened countless times before, but that the rebels expressed some basic philosophical principles, rejecting not just a particular regime, but rejecting oppression in principle. Almost. The American Revolution was the result of a hodgepodge of conflicting ideas, some supporting individual sovereignty, some supporting a ruling class. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution which followed some years later were a combination of profound insight and glaring contradictions. On the bright side, the discussion of the time was not just about who would be in charge, but focused heavily on the concept of individual rights and limiting the power of government. At the same time, the Declaration of Independence erroneously asserted that government can have a legitimate role in society to protect the rights of individuals. However, this has never been true in practice and cannot even be true in theory. As explained above, an organization which did nothing more than defend individual rights would not be government in any sense of the term. The Declaration also spoke of unalienable rights and asserted that all men are created equal as far as their rights are concerned. But the authors failed to realize that such concepts completely rule out any possibility of a legitimate ruling class, even a very limited one. The very principles they expressed were then immediately contradicted by their efforts to create a protector government. One day they were declaring that all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence, and the next they were declaring that some men, calling themselves Congress, had the right to rob, tax everyone else. U.S. Constitution Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Right, Congress has a right to levy taxes from the people. It is fucking crazy, right? If you think about it. It says one thing, and then it says another thing. It's unbelievable. Furthermore, the Declaration asserts that when any government becomes destructive of individual rights, as every government always does, the moment it comes into existence, the people have a duty to alter or abolish it. And yet, the Constitution claims to give Congress the power to suppress insurrections. U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. Right, so do we have the right to abolish or fight back against our government or not? Clearly we don't, because then Congress has the ability to destroy us. And if we were to try to do an insurrection, right, or abolish a government that's abusing us, they'd fucking go Hiroshima on our ass. You know it. You know it. This implies that the people have a right to resist government oppression, but that government has a right to violently crush them when they do. In short, the works of the Founding Fathers consist of a combination of profound wisdom and yet utter lunacy. In some places, they described quite well the concept of self-ownership in others. They sought to create a ruling class. They did not seem to notice that those two agendas are utterly incompatible with each other. The result of their efforts was, in one sense, a gigantic failure. The regime they created grew far beyond what both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists said they wanted. The Declaration and the Constitution utterly failed to keep government power limited. The promise of a government that would be a servant of the people, protecting their rights, but otherwise leaving them in peace, grew into the largest, most powerful authoritarian empire the world has ever known, including the largest and most intrusive extortion racket ever known, the largest and most powerful war machine in history, and the most intrusive and invasive bureaucracy in history. In truth, the idea was doomed from the beginning. Perhaps the most valuable thing the great American experiment accomplished was to demonstrate that limited government is impossible. There cannot be a master who answers to his slaves. There cannot be a lord who serves his subjects. There cannot be a ruler who is both above the people and subordinate to them. Unfortunately, there are still many who refuse to learn this lesson, insisting instead that the Constitution did not fail. The people failed by not doing it right, by not being vigilant enough, or by some other neglect or corruption. Oddly, this is the same excuse given by communists for why their flawed philosophy, when put into practice in the real world, always turns into violent oppression. The truth is that any form of authoritarian control, any type of government, whether constitutional, democratic, socialist, fascist, or anything else, will result in a set of masters forcibly oppressing a group of slaves. That is what authority is, all it has ever been, and all it ever could be, no matter how many layers of euphemisms and pleasant rhetoric are used in an attempt to hide it. And lastly, so last subsection here, the contract myth. The mythology surrounding the Constitution alleges that it served as a sort of contract between the people and their new servants in Congress. But there is not a shred of truth to that. One cannot, by signing a contract, bind someone else to an agreement. The idea that a few dozen white men, wealthy landowners, could enter an agreement on behalf of over 2 million other people is absurd. And look, I don't think he's saying that in the liberal, woke, anti-white terms. He's just talking historically who was in power at the time. That's just the fact. Furthermore, no contract can create a right held by none of the participants, which is what all government constitutions pretend to do. The form of the document makes it clear that it was not an actual contract, but an attempt to fabricate out of thin air the right to rule, however limited it was intended to be. An actual agreement by contract is a fundamentally different thing from any document purporting to create a government. For example, if 1,000 American colonists had signed an agreement saying, "We agree to give a tenth of what we produce in exchange for the protection services of the George Washington Protection Company," they could be morally bound by such an agreement. Making an agreement and breaching it is a form of theft, akin to going to a store and taking something without paying for it. But they could not bind anyone else to the agreement, nor could they use such an agreement to give the George Washington Protection Company the right to start robbing or otherwise controlling people who had nothing to do with the contract. Also, while the Constitution pretends to authorize Congress to do various things, it does not actually require Congress to do anything. Who in their right mind would sign a contract which did not bind the other party to do anything? In DeShaney v. Winnebago, 489 U.S. 189, the Supreme Court officially declared that government has no actual duty to protect the public. The result is that the Constitution, rather than being a brilliant, useful, valid contract, was an insane attempt by a handful of men to unilaterally subject millions of other people to the control of a machine of aggression in exchange for no guarantee of anything. The fact that millions of constitutionalists are desperately trying to get back to that in the hopes that it can save their country if the people try it again, after it utterly failed the first time, is a testament to the power and the insanity of the superstition of authority.